rain had been falling on the Vitelli mansion for 3 days straight, as if the sky itself had decided to mourn alongside the man locked inside its walls. The mansion sat at the very top of Creston Hill like a dark crown, surrounded by iron gates so tall that even the oldest trees in the garden could not see over them. The gates were always closed. They had been closed for 2 years. The guards who stood at the entrance did not smile, did not wave, and did not let anyone in unless they had been personally approved by the man of the house. Delivery men left packages at the gate. The mailman slid envelopes slots without ringing the bell. Even the birds seemed to avoid the rooftop of the Vitelli mansion, as if they could feel the heaviness that lived inside those walls. Inside, past the marble floors and the tall ceilings, and the paintings that had not been dusted in months, past the dining table that had not been set for dinner in almost a year, and past the grand staircase with the broken chandelier that nobody had bothered to replace, sat a man named Marco Vitelli. He was 35 years old. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the edges when it grew too long, and he almost never cut it anymore because he could not be bothered. His jaw was sharp and strong. His brown eyes, which had once made grown men look away when he entered a room, now looked like two pieces of cold glass. Beautiful, but without warmth. He was broad-shouldered and tall, or at least he used to be tall in the way that mattered. The way that made people step back when he walked toward them. But Marco Vitelli did not walk anymore. He sat in a black wheelchair in the middle of the largest room in the mansion, facing a window that looked out onto the gray, rainy garden, and he did absolutely nothing. This was what most of his days looked like now. Sitting, staring, waiting for nothing. On the small table next to him were 3 empty medicine bottles that should have been refilled 4 days ago, a glass of water that had not been touched, a stack of papers from his brother that he had not read, and a cracked phone screen that showed 14 missed calls. He had not called any of them back. The room smelled like old wood and cold air, and the only sound was the rain hitting the windows in long, tired streaks. It had not always been like this, not even close. 2 years ago, if someone had told the people of this cities that Marco Vitelli would one day sit alone in a dark room and refuse to see anyone, they would have laughed so hard they might have hurt themselves. Because Marco Vitelli back then was not the kind of man who sat alone anywhere. He was the kind of man who walked into a restaurant and the entire kitchen staff stood up straighter. He was the kind of man who made phone calls that ended problems before those problems had a chance to breathe. He was the head of the Vitelli family, one of the most powerful mafia families the city had ever known. And he wore that power the way other men wore expensive watches, quietly, but always visible, always felt. The Vitelli family had built their empire over 3 generations. Marco's grandfather had started with the docks, controlling what came in and what went out of the city's ports. His father has expanded into the markets, the constructions, businesses, and the private security companies that half the city's wealthiest neighborhoods relied on without knowing it. And Marco had taken everything his father built and made it stronger, smarter, and more untouchable than anyone had thought possible. People called him the Iron King, not because he was cruel for the sake of it, but because once Marco Vitelli made a decision, it did not bend and it did not break. He was fair, in the way that powerful men are fair, on his own terms, by his own rules, and always, always in control. And then one evening in November, 2 years ago, Marco got into his car after a business meeting, and the car exploded. The bomb had been planted underneath the back left wheel. Marco's driver, a loyal man named Pietro, who had worked for the Vitelli family for 11 years and had 3 children at home, died before the ambulance arrived. Marco was pulled from the burning wreckage, by two of his guards who refused to wait for help. He was alive. He was breathing. But when he finally woke up in the hospital 4 days later, the doctors told him the truth in the careful, practiced way that doctors tell hard truths, with steady voices and folded hands, and eyes that looked just slightly above his face instead of directly at it. His spinal cord had been damaged. His legs might never work properly again. He might spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. Marco had looked at the doctor for a long, quiet moment. Then he had asked everyone to leave the room. When the door closed, he sat in the hospital bed in complete silence for a very long time. Nobody knew what he was thinking. Nobody knew what he felt. When the nurse came back an hour later to check on him, his face was completely empty. Like someone had taken everything that used to live there and packed it away in a box and locked the box and thrown away the key. That was the day Marco Vitelli decided that the world had betrayed him and that the safest thing to do was to betray it right back, starting with every single person who tried to come close. He went home to the mansion. He closed the iron gates, and he started pushing people away with the same determination that he used to use to build his empire. His closest friends came to visit and were told he was not available. His old business partners sent gifts that sat unopened in the front hallway. His cousin flew in from another country and was turned away at the gate. And the nurses, the long, sad parade of nurses that his brother Bruno kept sending over because Marco refused to go to a rehabilitation center, lasted an average of 6 days, each before they packed their bags and left with red eyes and shaking hands. The first nurse cried when Marco told her that her presence in his homes was as useful as a broken umbrella in a storms. She left the same evening. The second nurse, it lasted a little longer, until Marco threw his dinner plate against the wall and told her that if she came into his room without knocking one more time, he would have her escorted out by the guards personally. She left the next morning. The third nurse was older and had been a nurse for 30 years. She thought she had seen everything. She lasted 9 days before Marco said something so cold and cutting about the way she walked into the room that she sat down in the hallway outside his door and cried for 20 minutes straight, and then called her daughter to come pick her up. 3 nurses in 2 weeks, and Marco sat in his dark room and felt nothing about any of it. The only person who stayed, who always stayed, was Rosa. Rosa had worked for the Vitelli family since before Marco was born. She was 61 years old, small and round and soft in the way that grandmothers are soft, with silver hair she kept in a neat braid, and hands that were always warm from the kitchen. She had held baby Marco when he was 3 days old. She had packed his school bag when he was 7. She had cried at his father's funeral standing right next to him. Rosa did not leave because Rosa understood something that most people did not, that the mean things Marco said were not actually about the people he said them to. They were about the pain he could not find words for. So when Marco was rude, Rosa simply said, "Yes, sir," and came back the next morning with fresh coffee and the newspaper and pretended that nothing had happened. But even Rosa could see that things were getting worse. He was not eating properly. He was not sleeping. His medicine was running out because he refused to let anyone order more. He sat in that dark room for hours without turning the lights on, and the look in his eyes, that cold, glass look, was getting harder and more distant every single week, like he was slowly disappearing from the inside. One evening, after Marco had gone to his room and slammed the door, Rosa sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded and her head bowed, and she made a decision. She was going to call the nurse agency one more time, but this time she was going to ask for someone different. Not someone with the most experience, not someone with the longest list of certificates. She was going to ask for the person that the agency said was their most patient nurse, the one who did not give up. The woman on the phone at the agency paused for a long moment when Rosa described the situation. Then she said, "I think I know exactly who to send you." 3 days later, on a gray Thursday morning, a small blue car drove up to the iron gates of the Vitelli mansion. The guard at the gate almost turned it away on instinct, because nobody just drove up to the gates without an appointment confirmed by Mr. Vitelli himself. But then he remembered that Mr. Vitelli's housekeeper had told him that morning to expect a nurse. He checked his list. He found the name. He opened the gate. The car pulled through slowly, as if its driver was not in a hurry. It parked in the circular driveway in front of the mansion. The door opened and Lily Santos stepped out. She was 27 years old. With warm brown eyes and dark hair she had tied back simply at the base of her neck. She was not tall. She was not loud. She did not look like someone who was about to walk into one of the most difficult situations of her professional life. She was wearing plain nurse's clothes and carrying one large bag over her shoulder, and she held a small umbrella over her head against the light drizzle. She stood in the driveway and looked up at the mansion for a long moment. The building loomed over her, dark and large and unwelcoming, with its heavy curtains drawn across most of the windows and the dead plants hanging from the front balcony railing. Lily had read Marco Vitelli's file 3 times before accepting this assignment. She knew about the accident. She knew about the wheelchair. She knew about the 6 nurses who had quit. Her supervisor had told her, very gently, that she was absolutely allowed to say no to this one. That nobody would think any less of her. Lily had folded the file closed and said, "I will take it." Her supervisor had blinked. "You sure?" And Lily had smiled, a quiet, certain smile, and said, "Somebody has to." Rosa opened the front door before Lily even reached the top step. She grabbed Lily's hands with both of hers and held them tightly. "Thank God," she said, in a voice that had relief in every single syllable. "Thank God you are here. Come in. I will get you tea. I will get you anything you want. Just please, please stay." Lily gave Rosa's hands a gentle squeeze back. "I am going to try my best," she said. Rosa led her through the house, past the dark hallways and the dusty paintings and the grand staircase, and filled her in quietly as they walked. Marco was in the East Room. He had not eaten breakfast. He had not slept well. He was, Rosa whispered with wide eyes, in a very bad mood today. Even by his standards. Lily listened to all of this carefully. She nodded. She did not look nervous. The door to the East Room was heavy and dark. Lily knocked twice, firmly, and then opened it without waiting to be invited in. Because she had learned, from years of nursing, that patients who were suffering sometimes used silence as a way to keep people out, and that waiting outside the door too long only gave the silence more power. She walked in. The room was cold. The curtains were almost fully drawn, letting in only one thin strip of gray morning light across the floor. Marco sat in his wheelchair near the window, his back mostly turned toward the door. He did not turn around when she entered. Lily looked around the room slowly and took it all in without making any expression at all. The empty medicine bottles, the cold food on the side table from last night that had not been touched, the general sense that this room had not had proper fresh air in a very long time. Then Marco spoke, without turning around. "You are the 7th one," he said. His voice was deep and flat and entirely unimpressed. "Let me save you some time. You will smile a lot in the beginning, the way they all do. You will try to make conversation. You will try to have what my last nurse called a breakthrough moment. And then I will say something that hurts your feelings, and you will go home and not come back. That is how this works. It has worked the same way every single time." He finally turned the wheelchair slightly so she could see his profile. His cold brown eyes looked her over once. The way someone looks at something they have already decided is not worth their time. You will leave by Friday, they all do. The room was completely quiet for a moment, and then Lily Santos set her bag down on the chair by the door, pulled out his medication schedule from her folder, looked at the empty bottles on the table, and said calmly, without even a single wobble in her voice, "Then I guess I will see you on Saturday." Marco went very still. In 35 years of life, and 2 years of deliberately making people miserable, nobody had ever answered him like that. Not with anger, not with tears, not with a dramatic speech about dignity and respect. Just that one quiet, certain sentence, as if she had already decided something that he had not been consulted on at all. He opened his mouth. Then he closed it. Then he said, very coldly, "Get out of my room." Lily finished writing the medication schedule on a fresh notepad, placed it neatly on the table next to his water glass, and walked back to the door. "Your medicine needs refilling today," she said simply. "I will take care of it. Lunch will be at noon." And then she walked out, closing the door quietly behind her, not slamming it, not rushing, just closing it, the way a person closes a door when they planned to open it again very soon. Marco stared at the closed door for a long time. In the kitchen, Rosa was pressing her hands together and looking at the ceiling the way people do when they are very quietly thanking someone upstairs for answered prayers. That afternoon, Bruno Vitelli arrived at the mansion in a long black car. He was 40 years old, handsome in a polished and practiced way, always wearing expensive suits, and always smelling like cologne that cost more than most people's monthly salary. He walked through the mansion like he owned it, which was something he had started to feel more and more over the past 2 years. Bruno visited Marco regularly. He brought expensive food and wine and sat across from his brother with a warm, easy smile and said things like, "You are looking better," even when Marco was clearly not looking better. He talked about family business, told Marco not to worry, told him that everything was being handled. He held Marco's shoulder in that brotherly way and said, "You just focus on getting healthy. Leave the rest to me." But that afternoon, when Bruno saw Lily moving efficiently and calmly through the hallway, refilling Marco's prescriptions, organizing his schedule, already making small improvements to a house that had been left to wither, something shifted very briefly behind Bruno's polished eyes. Something that was not warmth and was not welcome, though it disappeared so quickly behind his easy smile that Absurd would have had to be watching very carefully to catch it. That evening, Bruno stepped outside onto the back terrace to make a phone call. His voice was low and smooth. "The new nurse is here," he said. "Watch her." He hung up and went back inside and poured himself a glass of very expensive wine and smiled his perfect smile at the wall. That night, Marco could not sleep, which was not unusual. But the reason was unusual. He lay in the dark and thought about the nurse, about the way she had looked at his empty medicine bottles without judgment, about the way her voice had not shaken, about that one sentence, "I guess I will see you on Saturday," said so quietly and so certainly that it had been ringing around his head for the entire day like a bell that would not stop. He was still thinking about it at 2 in the morning when he heard something. Music, very soft, floating up from somewhere downstairs. Not a television or a radio. This was something gentler. Someone humming to themselves and moving around in the kitchen. Marco sat up in the darkness of his room. He listened for a long time. Then, with a movement that cost him something physically, and something else he could not quite name, he pushed himself into his wheelchair and rolled slowly toward the top of the stairs. From there, looking down through the wide hallway into the lit kitchen, Below, he could see Lily Santos. She had changed into simpler clothes after her shift had technically ended. She was making herself a cup of tea. She was moving slowly around the kitchen, picking up a mug, finding the tea bags, leaning against the counter while the kettle boiled. And she was humming softly to herself. And every so often she would do this small, unconscious little sway, like someone who had music in them that they could not quite contain, even when they were alone and tired and far from home. She looked perfectly content, peaceful even. In this heavy, dark, sad house that had not had real peace in it for 2 years, she looked like she had found a small, warm corner of it and settled right in. Marco watched her from the top of the stairs for a long time. He could not explain why he did not look away. He could not explain the strange, unfamiliar thing that happened at the very edges of his expression. Small, almost invisible, gone before it fully arrived, he turned his wheelchair around and rolled back to his room in the dark. But that night, for the first time in a very long time, he fell asleep before midnight. Nobody who watched the first week between Marco Vitelli and Lily Santos would have called it a beginning. They would have called it a standoff. Every morning, Lily arrived at his door at exactly 7:30. She knocked twice. She came in. She checked his vitals, put his medicine in front of him, and said good morning in the same calm voice, whether I responded or not. And for Theater's vitals, first several days, he did not respond. He sat in his wheelchair with his arms crossed and stared at the wall beside her head as though she were a tame piece of furniture he was still deciding whether to get rid of. She made no special effort to charm him. She did not speak more than was necessary. She did not fill the silence with cheerful chatter or encouraging speeches about strength and healing. She simply did what needed to be done, thoroughly, efficiently, and without asking for anything in return. And then she left the room until the next time he needed her. This, Marco discovered, was deeply confusing. He was used to people wanting things from him. Approval, attention, fear, money, loyalty, gratitude. Everyone who came near Marco Vitelli always wanted something from him, and he had gotten very good at identifying what that something was within the first few minutes of meeting a person. It was one of the things that made him excellent at running a powerful family. He read people the way other people read weather. He knew a storm was coming before the first cloud appeared. But Lily Santos was not asking for anything. She was not impressed by the house, or the paintings, or the guards at the gate. She was not nervous around him, the way people were nervous around powerful men. She was not performing kindness in the way that nurses sometimes do, so when they want a patient to like them. She was simply being kind, the way people are kind when it is their natural state and they do not know how to be anything else. This confused Marco, and the things that confused Marco Vitelli made him pay very close attention. The first real crack in the wall happened on a Wednesday, in the second week of Lily's time at the mansion. It was early morning and Marco had woken up before dawn again, which was becoming a habit he resented because it meant too many quiet hours alone, with thoughts he did not want to have. He had rolled himself to the window and sat watching the garden in the thin gray light before sunrise, and something about the morning, the color of it, or the smell of the wet grass coming through the slightly open window, had pulled him somewhere he did not want to go. To a memory of his father, standing in a garden very much like this one, teaching a much younger Marco the names of every plant that grew along the stone wall. Marco had been maybe 9 years old. He had not thought about that memory in years. He was still sitting there, completely still, when Lily came in at 7:30. She stopped when she saw his face. She did not say anything immediately. She put his medicine on the table, picked up her clipboard, and then said, without looking at him, You do not have to tell me what you are thinking about. But if you want to, I am not going to anywhere. Marco said nothing. Lily sat down in the chair near the window and waited. Another 2 minutes of silence passed, and then Marco, in a voice that was much quieter than his usual voice, so quiet it was almost unfamiliar coming from him, said, "My dog died last year. His name was Pharaoh. Nobody remembered but me." Lily looked at him gently. What kind of dog was he? Big brown, completely useless as a guard dog because he would make friends with anyone who came through the front door. He used to sleep at the foot of this wheelchair every evening. He sounds like he was good company. He was the only one who did not look at me differently after the accident. Marco said, and then stopped, as if he had not meant to say that part aloud. Lily did not jump on the moment or make it bigger than it was. She just nodded slowly and said, "I am sorry you lost him. That was all. No speech, no deep therapeutic reflection. Just those 5 simple, genuine words." Marco looked out the window again. His jaw was tight, the way it got when he was feeling something that he did not know how to process. But he did not close the conversation down. He did not send her away. They sat in that room together in something that was almost, not quite, but almost, comfortable silence. From that morning forward, something shifted. Not dramatically, not in the way stories sometimes describe a turning point, with a huge emotional moment and music swelling in the background. It was slower than that, quieter. It was the difference between a house in winter and that first day, Sissy, in late March, when the temperature rises just 2 degrees. Barely. Noticeable. But something in the air has changed, and the trees know it even before the people do. Lily started opening the curtains each morning, just a little at first. 6 inches of light along the bottom of the window. Then a foot. Then all the way. Marco complained about this exactly once, on the second day, and Lily said, "You can have the curtains closed at night. But your body needs light during the day. It affects your mood more than you think." And Marco had looked at her sideways and said nothing. And the curtains had stayed open. She brought flowers from the garden and put them in a vase on his windowsill. Plain ones, not expensive arrangements from a florist, just whatever was growing well along the stone wall. One morning, she brought in a small bunch of something that smelled exactly like the garden from his childhood memory, the one with his father. Marco did not say a word about this, but he did not ask her to take the flowers away either, and he looked at them for a long time when he thought she was not watching. The cooking afternoon was Rose's favorite story to tell for years afterward. It happened on a Sunday, which had always been. Though Marco had never told anyone this, his favorite day of the week back before the accident, because Sundays were the one day he allowed himself to do something purely for himself. And what Marco Vitelli used to do on Sunday mornings, in the big kitchen of this very mansion, was cook pasta from scratch. Not because he needed to, not because there was any shortage of cooks and staff, but because his mother had taught him when he was 12 years old, and he had never stopped finding it satisfying in a way that he could not entirely explain. The weight of the dough, the rhythm of the work, the smell of the tomatoes in the pan. He had not been in the kitchen in 2 years. That Sunday, Lily arrived with a bag of fresh tomatoes, good olive oil, pasta flour, and eggs. She set them out on a board next to the kitchen counter, pulled a stool over to the right height for someone in a wheelchair to work comfortably, and then turned to Marco and said, very simply, "Rosa tells me you used to make good pasta. Show me." Marco stared at the ingredients. He stared at the stool. He stared at Lily, who was looking back at him with an expression of complete patience and zero sentimentality. She was not trying to give him a healing moment. She genuinely appeared to just want to learn how to make pasta. Something in Marco's chest moved. He rolled himself to the counter. He looked at the flower for a moment, then his hands, which remembered things that the rest of him had been trying to forget, reached out and started working. Rosa appeared in the kitchen doorway 15 minutes later, drawn by the smell of fresh dough and something she could not quite name. Something that felt like the old house, the one that had existed before the gates closed. She stood in the doorway and pressed her hand to her mouth and did not make a single sound because she did not want to break whatever was happening. Marco's hands moved through the pasta dough with the sure, practiced confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times. He talked, quietly, without much expression at first, about the amount of flour, the way to tell when the dough was ready, how long the sauce needed on a low heat. And then gradually, without even seeming to notice, he started adding other things. Small things. My mother said the secret was patience with the dough. She said you cannot rush it. And then, a few minutes later, my father used to burn the garlic every single time, and then pretend he had done it on purpose. He almost smiled when he said that. Rosa had to turn around and face the wall for a moment. That evening, the three of them, Marco, Lily, and Rosa, sat at the large dining table that had been covered in a fine layer of dust for nearly 2 years. Rosa had cleared it and put a simple white cloth over it and lit 2 candles. They ate the pasta that Marco had made. It was excellent. Nobody said it was excellent because somehow saying it out loud felt like it would have been too much. But they all knew, and Marco, sitting at the head of his own table for the first time in 2 years, looked down at his plate for a moment with an expression that was not quite happiness, but was not pain either. It was something in between. Something on its way to becoming something better. Then Bruno visited, and something cold moved through the warmth like a draft through an open window. Bruno sat with Marco for an hour, doing his usual performance. The warm smile, the easy conversation, the reassurances about business. But his eyes kept moving to Lily, who was working quietly in the background, organizing Marco's afternoon medications. Bruno's eyes followed her with something calculating and careful hiding behind the surface of his charm. When Marco went to rest, Bruno caught Lily in the hallway. He smiled at her, a wide, perfect, practiced smile, and said in a quiet, concerned voice that he had clearly used many times before on many different people. "You are doing a wonderful job." Marco seems more settled. "I just want to make sure you are taking care of yourself too." He paused, and the smile stayed exactly where it was. "He can be difficult. He has been through a lot. Just make sure you maintain professional distance. For your own protection, you do not want to get too involved with a man like Marco. It is easy to do, but it would not be good for you." Lily looked at Bruno Vitelli for a long, quiet moment. She thanked him politely. She said she appreciated his concern. She smiled back, but as she walked away down the hallway, she turned something over in her mind carefully, like someone examining a coin they are not sure is real, because she had met caring brothers before. She had met protective family members, and something about the way Bruno's eyes did not fully match. His words was a small, precise alarm bell in the back of her very experienced, very observant mind. 3 days later, the alarm bell got much louder. Lily was tidying the shelves in Marco's room, something she did every few days to keep the space from becoming too closed in and cluttered. When she reached behind a small framed photograph on the middle shelf, and her fingers touched something that should not have been there. Something small and smooth and round. She looked at it carefully without picking it up. It was a camera, tiny, almost invisible, positioned behind the frame so that its lens had a clear view of the entire room, including the wheelchair, including the bed, including the spot by the window where Marco sat for hours every day. Lily stood completely still for a moment. Then she walked to the door and called for Marco in the same calm voice she used every day for everything. Marco came to his room and she showed him what she had found, pointing at it without touching it. She watched his face carefully. It went through several things in the space of 2 seconds. Surprise, confusion, and then something that was not anger, exactly, because anger was too hot and too fast for what she saw. What she saw was colder than anger, more controlled, more dangerous. "How long has it been there?" he said. It was not entirely a question. "I do not know," she said honestly. Marco called Tommy, his head bodyguard, a big, quiet man who had been with the Vitelli family for 8 years. Into the room immediately. He showed Tommy the camera. He told him to find out who had put it there and to report back to him directly by morning. Tommy looked at the camera, then he looked at Marco. His expression was careful in a way that was very slightly different from normal careful. A half second too controlled, a fraction too composed. And then he said, "I will take care of it, sir," and left. That night, Lily could not sleep. She lay in the small room at the end of the guest wing that Rosa had prepared for her, staring at the ceiling, and went over everything in her mind. The camera, Bruno's warning that had sounded too smooth, Tommy's face when he saw what she had found. She got up at midnight and sat by the window in her room, looking out at the dark garden below. The guards made their slow rounds along the fence line. The iron gates were closed and locked, the way they always were. And then she saw Tommy step out from a side door below her window. He walked to the far end of the garden, away from the guards, and took out his phone. He spoke quietly and quickly into it for about 2 minutes. His body was turned away from the house. Lily could not hear a single word. But just before Tommy ended the call and went back inside, the security light at the end of the garden flickered on for a moment and caught him in its yellow glow. And she watched him in that brief moment of light, and she saw his expression. It was the expression of someone reporting something to someone above them. And then she heard, just barely, just once, from the very last word before the phone moved away from his mouth, a name. Bruno. Lily sat back from the window slowly. The garden went dark again. The guards continued their rounds. Everything on the outside looked exactly as it always did. But inside her chest, something had gone very cold and very still, the way the air goes still just before a storm breaks. She knew now that something was deeply wrong in this house, and she knew that it involved Marco, and she knew with equal and total certainty that she was not leaving. That same night, unknown to Lily, unknown to anyone, in the private darkness of his room, with the door closed and the lights off so that nobody could see, Marco Vitelli was doing something. He was in his wheelchair at the edge of his bed, and he had his hands pressed flat on the mattress, and he was pushing. His legs, which the doctors had told him would never properly work again, which he had been secretly, stubbornly, desperately exercising in tiny movements for the past 3 weeks in the hours before dawn when the house was silent, were trembling from the effort. His jaw was clenched tight, sweat was on his forehead. He pushed, his legs shook. A feeling ran through them that the doctors had said might never come back. Not full sensation, not yet, but something. A faint, tentative, almost unbelievable signal that the connection was not entirely gone. He fell back into the wheelchair, breathing hard, hands gripping the armrests, but his eyes were different. For the first time in 2 years, behind the cold glass of Marco Vitelli's eyes, there was something that looked exactly like hope. He had not told anyone about the exercises. He was not ready. He was terrified that if he spoke it aloud, it would disappear, the way fragile things sometimes disappear, the moment you hold them too tightly. But he was trying. And in a house this dark, trying was everything. Later that night, Marco rolled his wheelchair out to the back garden. It was cool and still, and the clouds had cleared for the first time. in days, and the stars were out. More of them than he had noticed in a very long time. He sat there in the dark for a while just looking up. He heard the soft click of the garden door behind him and turned to find Lily, wrapped in a cardigan, stepping out quietly. She saw him and paused. He did not tell her to go away. She walked over and sat down on the low stone bench near his wheelchair. Neither of them spoke for a while. The garden was quiet around them. The stars were clear and bright above the roofline of the mansion. After a long time, Marco said, "Why did you stay? The others all left. Why didn't you?" Lily thought about this for a moment. She looked up at the stars, and then she looked at him. And her voice, when it came, was the most straightforward thing he had ever heard anyone say to him. "Because everyone deserves one person who does not give up on them," she said, "even when they make it very difficult, especially then." Marco looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked away, back at the stars. Something moved across his face that was too big and too raw to be named. He reached over slowly and he took her hand. His hand was large and warm and slightly rough, and it held hers the way someone holds something they are not sure they are allowed to have, carefully, like it might be taken away. Lily did not move. She did not make a sound. She just sat there with him, hand in hand, under the stars, in the quiet of a house that was slowly beginning to thaw. The truth, when it finally arrived, did not arrive gently. It came the way truths of that size always come. Not as a quiet revelation or a slow unfolding, but as a sudden, final collapse of everything that had been carefully balanced on top of it for far too long. Tommy came to Marco's room early on a Tuesday morning. He had not slept. It was visible in every line of his face. The gray-tinged skin, the red around his eyes, the way he held his big body differently, as if something inside him had gotten smaller overnight. He closed the door behind him. He stood near the entrance without sitting down, the way a person stands when they are not sure they deserve to be comfortable for what they are about to do. Marco looked at him and waited. He did not help Tommy find his words. He simply looked at him with those steady, patient eyes, the ones that had always made people tell the truth eventually. Not because Marco was loud or threatening in that moment, but because something in his gaze made lying feel like more effort than it was worth. Tommy looked at the floor. Then he looked at Marco, and then he told him everything. He had been reporting to Bruno since the beginning. Not everything. Not the small daily things. Not the medication, or the meals, or the quiet evenings. But the important things. When Marco seemed to be improving. When Marco seemed to be forming a connection with the nurse. When Marco had been talking to people outside the mansion, Bruno had wanted to know how Marco was. Not because he was worried, but because he was monitoring, keeping track of whether his brother was becoming a threat again. Marco did not move while Tommy talked. Not a muscle, not a breath that was any different from the one before it. He simply sat very still in his wheelchair and listened to every word. And then Tommy told him the rest. The car bomb 2 years ago had not been the Greco family. The Greco family had been hired, paid a significant amount of money to carry it out, and then to quietly accept blame through the channels that powerful families use when they want something to disappear. The money that had hired them had come from inside the Vitelli operation itself, from accounts that only one person, besides Marco's father before he died, had ever had access to. Bruno Vitelli had tried to kill his own brother, not out of hatred, Tommy said quietly, or at least, not only out of hatred, out of ambition, out of 2 decades of standing slightly behind Marco and wanting to stand in front. Out of years of being the older brother who was somehow never chosen to lead, watching his younger brother take control of everything their father had built, and do it with a natural authority that Bruno had never been able to, manufacture no matter how hard he polished his smile, or his suits, or his charm. Marco was never supposed to survive the explosion. When he did, Bruno had made a rapid adjustment. A brain like Bruno's was very good at rapid adjustments. A Marco in a wheelchair, isolated and angry and pushing everyone away, was actually better than a dead Marco in some ways. Easier to manage, easier to control, less likely to challenge what Bruno was quietly doing with the family's power, while Marco sat in a dark room and refused to see anyone. And then Lily had arrived, and Marco had started to come back, slowly, piece by piece, like light coming back into a room, and Bruno had gotten nervous. A recovering Marco was a dangerous Marco. When Tommy finished talking, the room was completely silent. Rosa was standing in the hallway. She had heard everything through the door that Tommy had not fully closed. She did not make a sound. She stood with her back against the wall and her hand pressed to her heart, and tears ran down her face steadily and silently, and she did not try to stop them. Lily was in the garden. She did not know what was happening inside yet. And Marco sat in his wheelchair in the middle of his room, and the thing that happened to his face was not what most people would have expected from a man who had just been told that the person he trusted most in the world, his own blood, his own brother, had tried to murder him and then spent 2 years pretending to care while slowly taking everything he had built. He did not explode. He did not shout. He did not pick something up and throw it. He went very, very still, the way a very deep river is still on the surface while enormous things move underneath it. He sat like that for a long time, and then Lily came back in from the garden and she read the room the way she always read rooms. Quickly, accurately, completely. And she walked to Marco without saying anything and simply stood beside him. Close enough that he could feel that she was there. She did not touch him yet. She did not ask what had happened. She just stood there, the way she had stood beside people in hospitals at 3 in the morning. When the news was as bad as news gets, and let him know without a single word that the room was not empty and he was not alone. After a very long time, Marco looked up at her, and what she saw in his face broke something in her chest. Not the cold Marco, not the angry Marco, not the frightening Iron King who had made 6 trained nurses pack up and go home. Just a man who had been carrying something enormous entirely alone for 2 years and who was only now understanding how much heavier it had actually been than he had allowed himself to feel. She reached out and put her hand on his. He held it. Hard. The way a person holds on when they are not sure of anything else. The decision Marco made in the days that followed was not what Bruno had expected. It was not, to be honest, what most people would have expected from a man who had grown up inside a world where the answer to betrayal was always swift, visible, and final. Marco chose truth over violence. Not because he had gone soft. Anyone who thought that was making the most dangerous possible mistake, but because he understood something that Lily had slowly, quietly taught him without ever intending to teach him anything at all. That real power was not about making people afraid. Real power was about making people see, and the most powerful thing Marco Vitelli could do was walk or wheel into that room full of men who had been listening to Bruno for 2 years and show them every single piece of evidence that Tommy had quietly been gathering for months, following a conscience that had taken too long to catch up to his loyalty. Marco called the meeting himself. He sent word through the proper channels, every head of every branch of the family. Every senior man who had been answering to Bruno. He asked them to come to the mansion on a Thursday evening. He did not tell them why. He simply let the weight of the request carry the message on its own, because everyone who received it understood that when Marco Vitelli called a condor-sauced meeting, You came to the meeting. The night before the meeting, Lily found Marco at the top of the stairs again. Not watching her this time, just sitting there, looking down at the long entrance hall below. At the painting on the opposite wall of his father that had hung there since before Marco was born. She sat down on the top step next to his wheelchair. They were quiet together for a while. "Are you frightened?" she asked. She was the only person in the world who could ask Marco Vitelli that, and not have him immediately close every door in his expression. He thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought about it. "No," he said, and then slowly, "Maybe of something, but not of this." She looked at him sideways. "What then?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, with a quietness that was not weakness but its exact opposite, "Of going back to who I was before you came here. Of being that person again." Lily looked at him for a moment. Her eyes were warm and steady. "You are not going back," she said simply, "because that person never let anyone sit beside him on the stairs." Something moved across Marco Vitelli's face that night. Something that was complete and whole and entirely real. It was not almost a smile. It was a smile. A real one, the first real one in 2 years, and it changed his whole face, the way sunshine changes a room that has been dark for a long time. It did not make him look softer. It made him look more like himself. The real self. The one that existed before 2 years of pain had built walls around it. He looked at Lily Santos in the soft light of the hallway, and he thought, with a certainty that surprised him with its quietness, that she was the bravest person he had ever met. Not because she had not been afraid, but because she had been kind when kindness cost something. In a house designed to push people away, she had shown up every single morning and refused to be pushed. The meeting the next evening was held in the long room at the back of the mansion, the one with the long table and the heavy chairs that had hosted 3 generations of Vitelli. Family decisions. The men came in and filled the chairs and looked around the room. And then the door at the far end opened and Marco came in. He wheeled himself to the head of the table. He did not apologize for the wheelchair. He did not reference it. He settled at the head of the table the way he had always settled at the head of a room, with the calm, certain, slightly heavy authority of someone who has always known exactly who he is. The room went quiet. Marco spoke for 20 minutes. He laid out everything. The bomb, the Greco family connection, the payments, the evidence Tommy had compiled, the camera in his room, the 2 years of Bruno using Marco's isolation to dismantle everything their father had built and rebuild it in a way that served only Bruno. He spoke without emotion and without theatrics, because the facts were dramatic enough on their own. And Marcoco had always understood that nothing destroys a lie faster than a calm, clear truth. Bruno arrived late. He walked into the room in his usual manner, smooth, easy, already smiling. And then he saw every face in the room turn toward him, and the smile lasted approximately 3 seconds before it fell off completely. There was no dramatic confrontation. Marco did not raise his voice. He simply looked at his brother across the long sole table and said, with a quietness that was more final than any shout, "Sit down, Bruno. Everyone here already knows." Bruno sat down. The family made their decision together. It was not the decision Bruno had feared most. It was, in many ways, worse. He was not hurt. He was not sent away in anger or in fear. He was simply removed. From his position, from his access, from his name within the operations of the family. He was given what was fairly his by blood, and nothing that had ever been Marco's. And he was asked to leave the city, and to understand that the goodwill that had been extended to him in the form of a peaceful exit was not something that would be extended twice. Bruno left. The room watched him go. Nobody called after him. And Marco Vitelli sat at the head of the table that had always been his, and the men around it looked at him. Some of them for the first time in 2 years, and saw what was still there, what had always been there under the anger, and the isolation and the pain. The steadiness, the intelligence, the quiet, immovable authority that had nothing to do with whether he was standing or sitting. "The Iron King doesn't need to stand to lead," one of the older men said quietly, not meaning for anyone to hear it. But the room heard it, and the room agreed. 3 days later, in the small hours before dawn, Marco was alone in his room. He had been alone in his room in the small hours before dawn many times over the past 2 years. But this time was different. This time he was not sitting in the dark waiting for nothing. He was at the edge of his bed, his hands on the mattress, his legs pressed to the floor. And he was trying something he had been secretly working toward for 5 weeks. He pushed. His legs shook the way they always shook. The trembling was enormous, the effort total, and for a long moment it seemed like every other time. Like the effort was going to be everything, and the result nothing, and then something happened. The shaking stilled slightly, his arms pushed, his legs, slowly, with enormous effort, with every molecule of stubbornness and determination that had made Marco Vitelli the man he had always been, responded. He rose. Not all the way, not steadily. He swayed and grabbed the bedpost and stood, actually stood, with both feet on the floor and his full weight going through legs. The doctors had told him might never carry it again. For 5 full seconds before, his knees gave out and he dropped back into the wheelchair, breathing like he had run a very long way. He sat in the dark and breathed hard for a while, and then the door opened. Lily had been awake early, the way she often was, and had seen the light under his door, and had knocked softly and heard nothing, and had opened it quietly to check on him the way she always checked on him. Without fuss, without drama, simply making sure he was all right. She saw him in his wheelchair, breathing hard. She saw the expression on his face. She looked down at the floor, at the slight scuff marks where his feet had been planted. She looked at his legs. She looked at his hands still gripping the armrests. She was a nurse. She understood exactly what she was seeing. She walked across the room slowly, and she knelt down in front of his wheelchair so that their eyes were level. She took both his hands in hers. Her eyes were full of tears that she did not try to hide. She did not scream, or leap up, or make a production of the moment. She just looked at him. This difficult, wounded, stubborn, extraordinary man, and held his hands and let the tears run down her face freely. Marco looked at her. His jaw was tight. His eyes were bright in a way that was new. "I think," he said, in a slightly unsteady voice, "I am going to need a lot more physical therapy." Lily made a sound that was half law and half cry, and it filled the quiet room like something that had been waiting to be heard for a very long time. "Good thing," she managed, "that I am not going anywhere." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he leaned forward slightly and touched his forehead gently to hers. They stayed like that. Foreheads together, hands held, in the still darkness of a room that had been cold for 2 years and was not cold anymore. "I was so angry," he said quietly against her forehead, "for so long. At everything. At the accident, at my legs, at the world. I thought that if I stayed angry enough, it would protect me from everything else." "I know," she said softly. "It didn't," he said. "It just kept me alone." "I know that too," she said. They sat together for a long time as the first light of morning began to come up outside window, not speaking, just present. Just 2 people who had arrived at the same quiet place from very different roads and found it good. Months passed after that morning, and the mansion on Krefankisten Hill began to change in ways that the city noticed slowly, and then all at once. The iron gates were opened. Not permanently. This was still a Vitelli house, and some things did not change. But regularly. People came and went. Rosa's sister visited from the coast for a whole week. The dead plants on the front balcony were replaced with living ones that Rosa and Lily chose together from the garden center one Saturday morning. The dining table was set for dinner 3 nights a week now, sometimes more. Marco's physical therapy was long and hard and painful and slow, and there were days when the progress was invisible and the frustration was immense, and he said things he should not have said to his physical therapist, and Lily would give him the look. The one that said, "You know better than that," and he would apologize, genuinely, which was something the old Marco had not done more than twice in 35 years. He did not get better all at once. He did not wake up one morning and throw the wheelchair aside and walk freely through the mansion. It was harder than that and more real than that. But the movement came, degree by degree, the way it always does when someone stops fighting themselves and starts fighting for themselves instead. One morning, on a day when the light was coming through the east window at exactly the right angle, and the garden outside was full of the green of late spring, Marco stood at the window. He was using a walker. His weight on both legs was still uneven, and the standing still took concentration. But he was standing, upright at his own window, looking out at the open garden and the wide sky beyond the iron gates. Rosa was in the garden below, planting something along the stone wall that Marco recognized with a quiet start as the same plants that had grown along the wall of his father's garden, the ones with the smell of his childhood memory. She must have found the name at some point. She had never mentioned it. He heard Lily's footsteps behind him before she arrived. He had learned the sound of her footsteps the way people learn the sound of things they depend on without realizing they have come to depend on them. She came to stand beside him and handed him a cup of tea, and he took it and looped his free arm carefully around her shoulders, and she leaned into him the way she always did now. Fully, comfortably, without hesitation. They looked out at the open gates together. "You know what the difference is," Marco said after a while, "between a cage and a home?" She looked up at him. "The door," he said quietly. "One keeps you in, the other lets people in." She smiled. He kissed the top of her head. She leaned in closer. Below in the garden, Rosa looked up at the window and saw them there. The two of them, together, in the light. And she pressed her hand to her chest and went back to her planting with a smile on her face that stayed there for the rest of the morning. The gates stayed open. The house was warm. The Iron King, who had built walls high enough to keep out the whole world, had finally, slowly, stubbornly, one brick at a time, let someone in. And that, it turned out, was the bravest thing he had ever done.